Fly me to the moon, let me play among the stars. Frank Sinatra's voice filled the Copa Room at the Sands Hotel on November 3, 1960. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the most dangerous performances aren't the ones on stage. At exactly 9:47 p.m., 23 federal agents surrounded the packed nightclub while Frank was mid-song, turning America's premier entertainment venue into the center of the most audacious FBI operation in Las Vegas history. Are you ready to discover the night Frank Sinatra faced down the federal government with nothing but his voice and his wit? Hit that like button if you want to know how the chairman of the board turned an FBI raid into the most legendary performance of his career, and let me know in the comments, would you have kept singing or run for the exits? The evening had started like any other night at the Sands. Frank was 3 songs into his regular midnight show, the Copa Room packed with high rollers, movie stars, and the kind of people who could afford $50 just to breathe the same air as Old Blue Eyes. Dean Martin was nursing a scotch at his usual corner table, while Sammy Davis Jr. had flown in from Chicago just to catch Frank's set. The atmosphere was electric, the champagne was flowing, and nobody in that room had any idea that they were about to witness history. Frank had chosen his set list carefully that night. He'd opened with Come Fly With Me, moved into I've Got You Under My Skin, and was now working his magic on Fly Me to the Moon when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A man in a dark suit had entered through the main doors and was scanning the room with the methodical precision of a professional. Then another, then 6 more. The audience was too entranced by Frank's performance to notice, but Frank had spent enough time around law enforcement, both as friend and foe, to recognize federal agents when he saw them. These weren't casino security guards or local cops looking for a quick autograph. These were FBI, and they were here on business. But here's where Frank Sinatra proved why he was called the chairman of the board. Without missing a single note, Frank subtly adjusted his position on stage to get a better view of the room. He could see agents positioning themselves at every exit, their hands resting casually but deliberately inside their suit jackets. Whatever they were here for, they weren't taking any chances on anyone leaving before they found it. Frank's mind raced through the possibilities. Was this about the Chicago connections that the press had been sniffing around? The alleged meeting with Sam Giancana that he'd denied having? Or was this something bigger? Something involving the presidential campaign that was heating up between Nixon and Kennedy? As he transitioned into the bridge of Fly Me to the Moon, Frank made a decision that would define not just this performance but his entire relationship with federal law enforcement for the rest of his career. Instead of panic, instead of cutting the show short, he was going to turn this FBI operation into the greatest show the Copa Room had ever seen. What happened next was so audacious that it took decades for the full story to emerge. Frank caught Dean Martin's eye across the room and gave him a subtle hand signal, the same one they'd used during their Army days to indicate trouble but stay cool. Dean's eyebrows raised slightly, but he kept sipping his scotch like nothing had changed. Sammy, always the quickest to read a room, had already spotted the agents and was now watching Frank with the intensity of a man waiting for his cue. "You know, ladies and gentlemen," Frank said into the microphone as the song ended, "I was just thinking about how much I love surprise guests, and it looks like we've got some very special visitors with us tonight." The spotlight operator, taking his cue from Frank's tone, began slowly expanding the light to illuminate more of the room. The lead FBI agent, a stern-faced man in his 40s named Special Agent Robert Kennedy, not the future Attorney General but a coincidentally named Fed from the Chicago office, was now clearly visible to everyone in the room. He'd been hoping to conduct this operation with some discretion, but Frank Sinatra had just made that impossible. Now, I know some of you folks are probably wondering what brings our friends from the federal government to Vegas on such a beautiful evening. Frank continued, loosening his tie with theatrical flair. Maybe they heard about our hospitality. Maybe they're fans of the music, or maybe, Frank paused for dramatic effect, they're here because somebody told them I throw the best parties in Nevada. The audience had no idea they were witnessing the most dangerous performance of Frank's career. Agent Kennedy was now in an impossible position. He could arrest Frank right there on stage, creating a massive scene that would be front-page news across the country. Or he could try to maintain some semblance of the covert operation they'd planned. Frank wasn't giving him much choice. "You know what, boys?" Frank addressed the agents directly now, his voice carrying the easy confidence that had made him a star. "Since you're here, why don't you grab a table? First round's on me. After all, you're working hard to keep America safe, and I respect that. We all respect that." The crowd, finally understanding that something extraordinary was happening, began to applaud. What had started as confusion was turning into appreciation for Frank's grace under pressure. Even the high rollers who normally couldn't care less about anything that didn't involve cards or dice were now completely invested in this improvised theater. Agent Kennedy made a calculation that he would regret for the rest of his career. Instead of moving in immediately, he decided to let Frank continue, hoping the singer would slip up and give them something they could use. It was a decision that would turn a simple surveillance operation into a legendary battle of wits. But Frank was just getting started, and what he did next stunned everyone in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to dedicate this next song to our federal friends," Frank announced, signaling the band to prepare for an impromptu number. "This one's called 'I've Got You Under My Skin,' and I think it's particularly appropriate tonight." As the opening notes filled the room, Frank began to sing, but with subtle lyric changes that only the sharpest ears would catch. Instead of "I've got you under my skin," he sang "I've got you under surveillance." Instead of "I've got you deep in the heart of me," it became "I've got you deep in the heart of Vegas." The audience was delighted by Frank's improvisation, thinking it was all part of the show. But Agent Kennedy was starting to realize that Frank Sinatra was making a mockery of their operation, and there wasn't much he could do about it without creating an incident that would embarrass the Bureau. Dean Martin, finally unable to contain himself, stood up and raised his glass. "Here's to the finest law enforcement officers in America," he announced loudly, "and to Frank Sinatra, who throws a party so good even the FBI wants an invitation." The room erupted in laughter and applause. What should have been a tense law enforcement operation was turning into a celebration of Frank's ability to turn any situation to his advantage. The real shock came when Frank revealed just how much he knew about why they were there. "You know, friends," Frank said as the song ended, "I heard through the grapevine that some folks have been spreading rumors about the kind of company I keep. They say I've been seen with certain gentlemen from Chicago, certain businessmen who might not have the cleanest reputations." Agent Kennedy's hand moved instinctively toward his handcuffs. This was exactly the kind of admission they'd been hoping to provoke. "Now I want to set the record straight," Frank continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "I've met a lot of people in my career. Movie stars, politicians, businessmen, and yes, even some folks who might have had their troubles with the law. But you know what I've never done? I've never let anyone, and I mean anyone, tell me who I can and can't be friends with." The room was dead silent now. Even the waiters had stopped moving. Frank had just drawn a line in the sand between himself and the federal government, and everyone knew it. "So if you gentlemen want to ask me some questions, I'm right here. But if you're here to intimidate me or my friends, well..." Frank smiled, that famous Sinatra smile that could charm a bishop or terrify a mob boss. "You picked the wrong Italian." What happened next would be talked about in FBI circles for decades. Agent Kennedy, realizing that this operation had spiraled completely out of control, made a decision that would haunt his career. He walked directly to the stage, climbed the 3 steps to where Frank was standing, and extended his hand. "Mr. Sinatra," he said loud enough for the microphone to pick up, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not here to arrest you or anyone else. We're here because we received a tip about some suspicious activity in the hotel and we needed to check it out. But I can see that the only thing suspicious here is how good this show is." The agent's words were a face-saving lie, and everyone in the room knew it, but Frank graciously accepted the olive branch. "Well, Agent Kennedy," Frank said, somehow knowing the man's name despite never having met him, "I appreciate your honesty. And I want you to know that if you ever need anything at all, you just let me know. After all, we're all Americans here." The handshake between Frank Sinatra and the FBI agent became the iconic image of the night, photographed by 3 different people and later used by Frank's publicity team to show that even the federal government respected the chairman of the board. But the real story was what happened after the handshake, when Agent Kennedy leaned in close to Frank's ear and whispered something that only Frank could hear. According to witnesses who read his lips, Kennedy said, "This isn't over, Sinatra. Who'll we watching?" Frank's response, captured by a lip reader in the audience and reported years later, was equally memorable. "I've been watched by better men than you, pal. And I'm still here." The performance that followed was unlike anything the Copa Room had ever seen. Energized by his victory over the federal agents, Frank launched into a 2-hour set that became the stuff of legend. He sang every song in his repertoire, told stories that had the audience in stitches, and even convinced Dean and Sammy to join him on stage for an impromptu Rat Pack reunion. But throughout the entire performance, the FBI agents remained in the room, no longer pretending to be undercover but not officially acknowledging their presence either. They'd become part of the show, unwilling participants in Frank's demonstration of power and charisma. During That's Life, Frank changed the lyrics to, "That's life. That's what people say. You're riding high in April, shot down by the FBI in May." The audience roared with approval while Agent Kennedy's face turned increasingly red. When Frank sang My Way, he modified the final verse to include the line, "I faced the feds and I may say not in a shy way, I did it my way." Even some of the FBI agents were trying not to smile. The most incredible moment came during Frank's final song. As the evening wound down, Frank announced that he had one more song to perform. "This one's for everyone in the room," he said, "whether you're here for the music, the gambling, or the law enforcement." He began to sing New York, New York, but as he reached the climax of the song, he made one final lyric change that brought down the house. "If I can make it there with the FBI everywhere, I'll make it anywhere. It's up to you, New York." The standing ovation lasted for 7 minutes. Even Agent Kennedy was applauding, though he tried to hide it by pretending to adjust his cufflinks. As Frank took his final bow, he looked directly at the federal agents. "Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure performing for you tonight. I hope you enjoyed the show, and remember, next time you want to catch my act, just call ahead. I'll make sure you get good seats." The aftermath of that night changed everything for Frank Sinatra. Within a week, the story of Frank's confrontation with the FBI was front-page news in every major newspaper in America. The headlines ranged from "Sinatra sings down the feds" to "Chairman of the Board versus the Federal Bureau." Public opinion was overwhelmingly on Frank's side, with editorials praising his grace under pressure and his refusal to be intimidated. The FBI, for their part, tried to downplay the incident. Official reports described it as a routine security check that had been blown out of proportion by the entertainment press. But internal memos released decades later under the Freedom of Information Act told a different story. Director J. Edgar Hoover was furious about the public embarrassment and ordered increased surveillance on Frank and his associates. Agent Kennedy was quietly reassigned to a desk job in Omaha, effectively ending his field career. Years later, in his retirement memoir, he wrote, "I've arrested bank robbers, gangsters, and communist spies, but I've never met anyone who could control a situation the way Frank Sinatra did that night. He turned our operation into his show, and there wasn't a damn thing we could do about it." The performance had consequences that reached far beyond entertainment. The Kennedy administration, which took office 2 months later, found itself in an awkward position regarding Frank Sinatra. On one hand, Frank had publicly supported JFK's campaign and had connections that could be valuable to a young president. On the other hand, his defiance of federal law enforcement had made him a symbol of resistance to authority. Frank's relationship with the Kennedys would become increasingly complicated over the next few years, culminating in the famous falling out over Frank's alleged mob connections. But those who knew the real story traced the beginning of that conflict back to the night Frank humiliated the FBI in front of 800 witnesses. Dean Martin, in a 1975 interview, summed up the evening perfectly. "That night, Frank showed everybody why they called him the chairman of the board. He didn't just sing his way out of trouble, he turned trouble into entertainment. I've seen a lot of performances in my time, but I've never seen anything like watching Frank Sinatra make the FBI part of his backup band. The legendary Copa Room performance established precedents that lasted for decades. After that night, law enforcement agencies developed new protocols for dealing with high-profile entertainers during investigations. The Sinatra rules, as they became known within FBI circles, emphasized discretion and coordination with public relations departments to avoid the kind of public embarrassment that had occurred at the Sands. Frank, meanwhile, had learned valuable lessons about the power of public performance to shape narrative. He would use similar tactics throughout his career when facing legal or political challenges, always ensuring that any confrontation happened on his terms, in front of friendly audiences who were predisposed to support him. The Copa Room itself became legendary, partly because of that night. For years afterward, visitors would ask to sit at the table where Dean Martin had toasted the FBI or to see the spot where Frank had shaken hands with Agent Kennedy. The Sands capitalized on the story, eventually adding a plaque commemorating the night Frank Sinatra taught the FBI how to swing. The final twist in this incredible story came decades later. In 1998, 3 years after Frank's death, the FBI released a heavily redacted file on Frank Sinatra that had been compiled over 4 decades. Among the documents was Agent Kennedy's original report from the Copa Room incident, which had been classified as operational security eyes only for 38 years. Kennedy's report told a different story than the one that had appeared in the newspapers. According to the agent's account, the FBI had received a tip that Frank was going to receive a briefcase full of cash from Chicago outfit representatives during his performance that night. The raid had been planned to catch this transaction in progress. But the briefcase never materialized, and Kennedy's report concluded that either the tip had been false or Frank had been warned in advance and called off the meeting. The report noted that Frank's behavior during the incident was consistent with someone who knew exactly why we were there and was determined to make us look foolish. The report's final paragraph was particularly telling. Subject demonstrated understanding of media manipulation and public relations. Recommend extreme caution in any future operations involving Sinatra. His ability to control narrative and generate public sympathy makes traditional law enforcement approaches ineffective. And that's how Frank Sinatra turned an FBI raid into the greatest performance of his career. The Copa Room incident became a defining moment not just for Frank but for the relationship between entertainers and law enforcement. It proved that in America, talent and charisma could trump authority and power, at least temporarily. It showed that the court of public opinion was sometimes more powerful than any federal court. Most importantly, it demonstrated Frank Sinatra's core philosophy that every challenge was just another stage, every confrontation was just another audience, and every crisis was just another opportunity to prove that nobody, not the mob, not the government, not even the FBI, could stop him from doing things his way. The Copa Room was demolished in 1996 when the Sands Hotel was torn down to make way for newer casinos. But the legend of that November night lives on, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful performances happen when the stakes are highest and the spotlight reveals not just talent but character. Frank Sinatra faced down the federal government with nothing but his voice, his wit, and his unshakable belief that the show must always go on. And in the end, he proved that the chairman of the board answered to only one authority: the music itself.